Good afternoon. Today we're going to speak about the banking sector, Basel III, and monetary policies of countries. With us here we have Jong, who is the chief economist of ABN AMRO, and Enrico Perotti, who is a professor of international finance here at the University of Amsterdam. We hope to have a very lively debate, and if you have any questions about this, then please go to the microphone and join us in the debate. Let's start. Well, let us briefly discuss what is Basel III? What is it? Someone wants to...
Well, it's a tightening up of the regulatory framework, and of course, with the crisis behind us, Basel III is also an attempt to make the banking sector more solvent and more stable and secure liquidity a lot better.
And how was it different from Basel II? In which ways?
Well, the solvency and liquidity requirements are higher.
Stricter?
Yeah, a lot stricter.
Okay.
There's actually still quite a bit that is not decided in Basel. There is a set of proposals. In part have been accepted. There's still some elaboration. I think adding, so that's right, we have a tightening of rules, but we have also potentially new rules. And the problem was that Basel II was missing
some rules.
Was missing some understanding of how the structure of the system. It was too simple. It was an econometrician green because he was studying every bank as an individual risk object and to be controlled with a buffer. And the problem is much more complex. There's a systemic problem. The financial system is very interrelated, and you can have transmission of shocks. And so what happened was, tragically, that using the very micro model missed completely how risk was building up potentially in the system, liquidity risk and other type of related risk. They were simply not covered in Basel II. So in Basel III we now have, for instance, liquidity principles. There were no liquidity principles in Basel II, basically. They were abandoned because basically there was a certain belief in a sense that the market would always be there for the banks, and it wasn't. So there were real holes. So we have a tightening, but we have really holes to
With equity requirements plus also the liquidity.
Right, and special treatment and also special resolution for large banks, how you deal with them. How can you close down credibly a big bank? So all the treatment of special systemically important institutions are going to be different. After all, DSB went bankrupt and ABN AMRO didn't, so there's a difference across banks. And that is something that was not treated at all, and it has to be treated next time.
So now in the future, banks know better how to deal with a situation like this? So
well, if these rules are introduced, for now, they've been much postponed.
Yeah.
I think Basel III is still a castle that will have to come down, but implementation is pretty delayed.
No. Basel III has started for us. I know that it's going to, yes, there are still a lot of areas that need to be filled in, and a lot of measures will not really, finally kick in until 2019, I think. But for a bank, you have to start working on the basis of Basel III. So when I look at how we do our asset and liability management, it's a lot is already geared towards Basel III.
Okay.
And the differences between Basel II and III are significant. So you actually need time.
Time to adjust the banking, time to adjust
time.
equity ratios, etc.
It's one thing actually that Enrico said that I would like to sort of respond to. Implicitly, he said, I think, correctly if I'm misinterpreting you, but that Basel II had a lot of good elements, but we kind of missed the big picture. Mm-hmm. And I must say, I've worked under the Basel II regime, and I always felt in our own organization, we have all these risk guys and all these modelers, and everybody looks at their own little model, and then they do stress tests, and then everybody is happy that everything works out okay. And in my in my experience, we relied far too much on models simply, because we had all these models and we thought, they describe the world and we will avoid all sorts of problems. But, even in those days, we were arguing, nobody's looking at the bigger picture, and there's far too much leverage building up in the system. But the regulatory framework wasn't fit to cope with that. Now, there's an important difference, but I still wonder whether the system is going to become even more complex now. And I still think that the risk remains that we rely far too much on detailed modeling. And I still, the Basel III has to prove itself, and I wouldn't be surprised if it still misses at least elements of the bigger picture.
But then what is the alternative to use detailed modeling? It is a very complex issue.
Well, sometimes, okay, I'm not an econometrician, so I have a natural dislike of econometric models. I prefer common sense, and that has worked quite well for me. I would hope that the central bankers, or the supervisors I should say, that they will apply a decent dose of common sense this time.
Okay, can I respond to that? So first of all, let me agree that Basel II rely way too much on models, but the problem is not models, but the specific models that you relied upon. The models were looking very complicated math-wise, but the assumptions were too simple, way too simple. So the problem, in the end, we always use models.
The underlying assumptions to the model.
My assumption was market efficiency, eternal liquidity, incredible market depth, and no systematic correlation. If you assume that, you can do a lot of very complicated math on details, but you're missing the big picture. So I think the problem is with an econometric approach that doesn't use economics. When one of the big debates in the regulatory prudential academic discussion is, suppose that a number of years has passed without a crisis. The longer the time passes without a crisis, do you think the chance increases or decreases?
It looks like it decreases, but actually...
An econometrician will say it decreases. An economist will say it will increase if the econometricians are the ones that set the rule. Because the economy is a living thing. It adapts. And so if you have underestimated risk using simple long-time series model, then you are misguiding the system going forward. So I think we cannot help using model because there is no such thing as common sense. Common sense uses assumptions, we all know. I mean, I'm always frustrated since I'm a theorist dealing with people, they say, oh, this is all theory, but I know how to do things by common sense. Common sense is a model also. It's a sensible model, robust to conventional situation, but it has its own assumption. And you have to be aware of your assumption. I mean, the beauty of model is not that they tell you the truth, but they tell you what assumption you're making, a good model. So I think I'm happy with less simplistic models, and models that in a sense have more robust assumptions, which can come from common sense and stuff. But the model we don't escape, because if you escape model, you only have religion. After that, it's average.
So we don't need to rely so much on the assumptions, we need
No. We need to understand the assumptions.
Understand the assumptions, we need to look beyond the models and use our common sense.
No, I didn't say that.
But I say it.
Okay, that was his opinion. Okay. Now we see in the Basel III framework that we see that Tier 1 capital ratio will be 4.5%. We see capital conservation buffer, counter-cyclical capital buffer, capital for systematically important banks. Are these proposed regulations sufficient to ensure healthy banks?
Depends on the ratios.
The ratios that were given in the Basel III.
Depends on the ratio that come out in the end. There is a lot of political lobbying on these ratios. There is going to be a lot of pressure to not make it too expensive for banks. So we'll see what comes out. If they tell you that the proposal is 12.5, it doesn't mean that it will be 12.5 by the end of this 8 years transition period.
Could you elaborate on that? Because
I think that the point is that politicians need to agree to these things. So we have, the Basel Committee is a technocratic group that thinks about what makes sense, but in the end, it has to be received in national legislation. and it's supposed to be coordinated by them. But politicians are not. Right now, in some sense, part of the problem, we just have too much debt. There are many countries that are also very exposed to the market. They need to raise funding. So it's not clear that politicians would be as strict as we should have them, because they like to keep the credit flowing going.
For the economy to be growing.
Yes, because it doesn't mean necessarily it's good in the long term, but it's good in the short term. And you know, politicians have time horizons that are not very long. So the point is, for them, they might prefer more credit, even though it's not necessarily fully stable, to less credit, because it boosts in the short-term consumption, income, and the cost you don't see yet. Then you can always blame on the next guy, like it's Bush say it's all Obama's fault. To give a good example.
Okay, but if we look at the regulatory measures that are now proposed, and when the G20 leaders come together, they have a set of rules. We're going to do this, we're going to do this. Of course, in the end, national politics will always make the rules bend a little bit this way or this way. Or
yeah, but it would bend in the aggregate. They would be the risk is that they'll be too soft in the aggregate. That's the risk.
What do you think?
What is your perception on this?
Well, how high do we need to build the dikes for Holland never to get flooded? You know, and what is the cost attached to that? I think it is an illusion to think that we will never, you know, that you can find a system that will make sure that you will never have a financial crisis again. History shows, you know, over many centuries, and there's beautiful work done by Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff in articles and in books. History, you know, the experience shows that basically we struggle from one crisis to the next, and what we're trying to do, I guess, is to lengthen the periods between crises. I think it is very, very hard, if not impossible, to determine a level of such ratios where you can say, you know, everything is fine. It doesn't exist. And problem, of course, also is you focus now on things that you know went wrong in the last crisis. The system somehow will, you know, change. Bubbles will build. The system will find a way to build up leverage again, I think. Maybe not in banks, but elsewhere, I don't know. And you know, you may have new, but you know, you're bound to get new problems. I think actually, you know, what is now suggested looks like, to me, looks like a pretty tight framework, and probably for the economy also bearable, and probably we will be able to avoid a new crisis for quite a while.
So tight as in responsible.
Yeah, I think, sure. Of course, you know, one thing though you must also say is that some of these ratios, you know, quite a few banks have already ratios that meet these new requirements.
ABN also?
I think our tier 1 ratio is already up to the required level. But okay, our situation is special because, yeah.
Okay. So you believe finally that if Basel III will be executed as they are talking about it now, there's a good chance that the system will get help?
Well,
I have some more critical perspective on this.
No, I think if it were implemented as it is designed, as it was proposed by the Basel Committee, it would be quite stable. I also think, but I think some provision would be weakened. I think some were actually very expensive. I think you're right, you cannot build immense dams, say, so that we never flooded. Some provision were expensive, but I think the ways they're going to be, what I'm concerned is that going forward, the provisions, the final tightening won't be quite as much. And I think on capital we'll probably do okay. I'm more concerned about liquidity because that's something that people don't understand. Yeah.
So what do you exactly mean with the liquidity risk?
When think of a bank as a pile of assets which has some risk, and you create a capital buffer and you say so that no one suffers the losses, if these people will absorb losses. So if you have a larger buffer, you think I'm protecting everybody. But there is another source of risk, which is the funding maturity for the rest of the balance sheet. So if your fund is say 8% capital or 10% capital, it looks very solid. But then imagine that 90% of your balance sheet is funded overnight, which means that every morning you have to end up repaying your entire 90% of your balance sheet because your fund is so short term. Now that is a separate dimension of risk. It goes across time and not just across states. And that is something Basel II completely ignored. The risk, the sort of unstable fund. And I think there we need to do a lot more. I think what Basel III has proposed is not adequate because if you do literally what they say, it would be really expensive. I can see why banks would say it would be absurd, like 30 days liquidity, it's absurd. And if you don't do it then it has to be resolved. So I think that is still an issue for progress.
Maybe just to add on the liquidity thing, you know, I agree. You know, the liquidity risk is misunderstood very often. Before the crisis, we did internally, we did lots of stress testing, and our conclusion very often was, if we're going to be put out of business, it's because of a liquidity problem, not because of a solvency problem. So that made us very aware of the liquidity sort of issues. But in a way, central banks should, when the liquidity problem arose, central banks responded. Most people think and say that they responded very quickly. I think that is true. But even the central banks didn't fully understand the nature of the problem. It took a long time for the ECB to provide long-term liquidity to banks. And we had to ask the ECB for it. They didn't understand that this is what they had to do. They only did that sort of in the middle of 2009. I think now they understand the nature of liquidity problems a lot better. And a central bank, if a commercial bank is solvent, a central bank should be able to provide liquidity, if needed. So I think there is a very important role for the central bank there. Of course, on the solvency side, that's not the case. You can't expect the taxpayer to step in all the time. So, I agree, but I think, there should be another role for central banks to provide more liquidity under certain circumstances.
I think there's a question from the public.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I have a question. We're talking about ratios, Tier 1 capital 4.5% now, up from 2%, I believe, in Basel II. All those ratios, they need to constrain the amount of debt a bank can loan to the people, right? In 2007, a report of JP Morgan, I believe, showed that an average bank in the UK had a loan deposit ratio of 127%. How would that have been possible under Basel II? But still, how can we restrain it in Basel III? Because how will 2.5% of raise in Tier 1 capital put any restraint on actually the unlimited money growth we've experienced under Basel II? Right.
I just want to have a clarification. Are you asking whether the higher capital ratio will reduce the volume of credit?
Sorry?
Are you asking whether higher capital ratio will reduce the volume of credit?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's your question.
Yeah. But how will it make a difference now than it did under Basel II?
Well, clear under Basel II there were lots of incentives to expand credit. And in Marion's way, because you could actually lever it up. Yeah. And so bankers had an incentive to go for more and more risky credit, in which they were picking up profit, and with lower leverage. It is clear that they won't be able to do it on such a narrow base as they did before. But whether the volume of credit falls or not, so there are two issues. First of all, the wrong kind of credit should stop. It doesn't make any sense to build more condos on Spanish beaches. There are enough. So it's not true that more credit is better. It depends how much intelligence goes into the credit itself. Because in the end, the money has to be paid back. I think that's the first issue. On whether overall volume of credit drops, depends whether bank shareholders are willing to accept a lower rate of return, as they should. So. The only way you're going to compress the volume of credit is whether when you increase capital ratio, no one is adding capital. But I think, the direction should be exactly towards insisting that that there is more equity capital going there, so that the volume of credit doesn't need to be.
Yeah, but is Basel III answering to what you just said, that there should be more capital ratios?
They could do two things. They could cut the volume of lending, or they could raise capital, and we hope they do the second. And in everything should push them towards doing that. Personally, I think that's the right virtual cycle. The people who say, oh well, banks will lend less because they need to put more capital down, are taking capital as a fixed quantity. And it shouldn't be a fixed quantity.
Well, but capital has a price. I think the questions you're asking are very good, but very difficult to answer. And when you look at what various people say about these issues, it's interesting or maybe embarrassing. The Institute for International Finance, which is a lobby club for banks, they published a report a couple of months ago, and they argued that Basel III is going to cost Eurozone economies 4.5% in GDP over, I don't exactly know, and also other changes in regulatory framework, but they estimate it's going to, the cost is 4.5% of GDP in Europe. In Japan, a lot less, and then the US is in the middle. Then the BIS did a study, or did two studies actually. Of course, they are, they're the supervisors, and they're saying the cost of Basel III is very small. So you have the banks saying the cost is very high, and therefore, let's please keep it reasonable. And the supervisors are talking their book in these studies. And when you have estimates diverging so enormously, it is clear that people are talking their book, I think. And the truth is, we don't know.
How come these estimates are so much diverging?
Because they have conflicting interests.
Simply that?
Yes.
Also, they use different assumptions.
Which is not unrelated.
No.
But it's possible that the economic growth of the last years is also partly funded by the financial sector. So the growth of the economic growth is caused by the financial bubble. So maybe the growth of the last years wasn't real.
I agree. Yes. Some of it was sure. It was bad credit going to the wrong assets, generating short-term income and destroying savings in the long term. Yeah.
So part of the decreasing economic growth is not caused by Basel III, but just because the economic growth was more healthy.
A lot of the growth we had was inflated, and we don't have very high productivity growth in developing countries. In developed country, we shouldn't expect to have real economic growth at a very high rate, and we've had, I think, higher growth than what we deserve. And how did we do it? We funded with debt, keeping up a level of consumption or wrong investment that kept income up, but in the end was destroying the value of savings. You cannot do that very long, and we shouldn't do that. That's why credit growth is not the right variable %. You want good, healthy credit growth, not credit growth per se.
It's actually, all the research that I'm aware of shows that the best early indicator for a financial crisis is unhealthy strong credit growth. It's really quite simple. I was referring to sort of work we'd done in our bank before the crisis. I remember being in meetings with the board where I raised the issue of excessive credit growth and too much leverage in the system. So sit down with the board and say, look guys, this development we don't like so much. Then they said, well, Mr. Jong, that's interesting. What do you suggest is going to happen? I said, look, the system is going to deleveraging. That's going to be a painful process. So they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, financial institutions will fail. And what we need to do is we need to be stronger than our neighbors, because when they fail and we're still standing, then leverage is out of the system and we can continue our lives. And then they say, well, excuse me, did you say that important financial institutions will fail? I said, yeah, that's what I said. And they said, well, yeah, that's a joke, goodbye. It was an embarrassing experience.
For them?
Well, with hindsight. But at the time, it was a career stopper for me.
And when was this exactly?
This was, I think, in 2006, 2005, 2006.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, something that happened today was that the professor, Anat Atmati, maybe he's familiar to some of you, and many other distinguished professors published an article in the Financial Times. It was today, and the message was Basel III proposals fail to eliminate key structural flaws in the current system. And this is because they were speaking about the issues of leverage and the danger of proliferation of synthetic AA securities that we saw before the crisis, tax codes, and I believe that you have written something about the tax codes before. Well, can you explain us why Basel III cannot capture this issue?
I'm not sure, I haven't read the article, but I know Admati's position. I heard her present 2 weeks ago at OBS. She's very much against leverage, and she takes the view that leverage is too encouraged in the fiscal system. I mean, every industry is taxed, they value-added tax, except the financial industry. The input of the financial industry, credit, actually gets a tax break. So if you're borrowing, you can deduct payment to the bank as so let me be frank, the level of taxation on banks is low.
Too low or low?
I think it might be too low. I think maybe the issue is a bit less about banks and more about leverage. The point is we are unconditionally supporting high leverage in the fiscal system. And it doesn't make all the economic sense. It's not true that you should be able to deduct all interest because it's a business expense.
So would it be a solution to have another tax system which...
I think we're not probably going to get there, it's too difficult. But I think there is a case that it's not clear that you want to maintain tax deductibility of interest payment beyond a certain amount of leverage. This is one way to think about it. I don't see this moving on the, it's too big, it's
Why
too
not?
fundamental. It's too big, I think, I don't know.
Well, I totally disagree here. Well, it sounds, I never thought I would quote the old former President Ronald Reagan, but I think he once said, we have a crazy system, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, tax it even higher. If it stops moving, subsidize it. And the feeling I have is, they talk about bank tax and super tax on banks, etc. This particular aspect, there is a certain symmetry in the tax system. If interest income is taxable, then surely interest expenses should be tax deductible. And I can't, to do away with that symmetry, I think would create a lot of problems.
Isn't it so that if banks have an extremely high leverage and they're benefiting a lot from having more leverage, that it should be in the form of a tax policy that you would encourage them less to have even more leverage? That's what the tax system is going to do, I think.
Well, banks are taxed on their profits. A corporation tax is not a progressive system, so why would you want to apply that to banks? Just have a regulatory framework that prevents them from building up excessive leverage.
That would be enough, according to you?
I think so, yeah.
Well, I stand by what I say. In any industry, the inputs, when you buy inputs, you pay BTV. You don't pay BTV when the financial sector gets
VAT for the industry.
I pay my tax in the Netherlands. But the financial sector, no. And if you want to talk about symmetry, that's not obvious at all. I can see why, I know the history and I understand also it's difficult to implement this tax, but let's not start from the fantasy the banks are very taxed. That's all.
Good. Oh, but I'm still interested. If such a system, somebody has to start thinking about a system like this or starts to say something. I've some ideas about it?
There are economists that, if you look at the IMF report on bank tax, one of the things they say is that the whole issue of tax exemption or interest payment should be at least considered, but there was zero follow-up. No one has an incentive in picking up so much of a fundamental question. Nobody.
Yeah.
So the idea is around, but no one imagined that it might be reversed.
Is it also because the banks have too much incentive and too much power in this sense.
It goes beyond the banks because everybody deducts interest payments. You know, if you own a house, you deduct interest payment. Companies deduct interest payments. It's so much at the heart of our system. But that we should remember we have a bias towards that.
Yeah.
And that is something that we may need to contain because we've been moving more. You look at leverage ratio in every industry, including financial industry, it keeps going up since the 60s at the individual level. You look at household debt in the US, terrifying. In the UK, I mean, we just rely too much on that. And I think that's one reason why banks should rely less on that and more on their own equity as well.
I think those historical comparisons, you know, debt ratios starting in the 1960s or even in the 1950s, I think that's a fallacy. The world was significantly under-leveraged in the 1950s.
1910 would be even worse for you.
It is very, you know, it depends on the institutional structure also of the financial system. It depends on a lot of things. It is very hard to determine, let's say, if you have sort of an overall leverage ratio for the economy as a whole or for particular groups of households, very, very hard to determine what is the optimal level.
But you might have a sense that it's gotten too high.
Yes,
I don't know what the optimal is.
But it's already, you know, we have had a correction. You know, also when you say the economy grew too rapidly, well, we've had a very significant correction in terms of our level of GDP. When I look at the leverage ratios that you now see, when you look at for example, the savings rate of US households, I think most of that correction is already behind us. And you know, I think the buildup of leverage, yes, it's been too much, and so some of the growth that we have achieved was probably sort of phantom growth, if you like. But let's not forget that the building up of leverage has actually raised standards of living of lots and lots of people, and a lot of research shows, as far as I'm aware, that economies with a very rudimentary financial system really get a boost in their growth rate once their financial system becomes more sophisticated.
But if we bring it back from the financial system and the economy as a whole to just the financial sector, if we compare those, isn't it so that in the last 20 or 30 years, the leverage of the financial sector has grown much faster than the leverage of the economy as a whole or other sectors?
Yes, that's true. And certainly, that's absolutely true.
A dangerous observation.
Yes, but you know, there again though, there is a lot of double counting there, and you know, but okay, the financial system has built up sort of an internal degree of leverage that is extremely unhealthy, and when things went wrong there, you got into a downward spiral that was devastating. So that is, I think, what you need to keep an eye on, but not necessarily the overall leverage ratio of the system as a whole, in my opinion.
Okay, on a somewhat different notion, in your blog post of the 3rd of August, you mentioned that Basel III will probably be good for the stability of the system, but it could prove to be a difficult period for employees and clients of the banking sector, ABN AMRO. Yes. Could you tell us why it will be difficult for employees in ABN?
Well, not only ABN, but
in the banking sector.
I think what Basel III will do is it will make banking more expensive. So the question is, you ask for more capital. Okay, in theory, it shouldn't make a difference because the suppliers of capital should feel safer and therefore demand a lower return. In practice, it doesn't work exactly like that. So on balance, I think the capital costs of banks will go up, and somebody will have to pay that. And that is, that can only be a few, or there can only be one or a couple of a few groups. The shareholder
bonuses of directly not be responsible way of.
Well, either we can charge customers more. I think that is currently happening in the mortgage market in Holland. Typical example of the market has shrunk. The country is addicted to mortgages. We've more than twice as many mortgages as other countries. And the banks have shrunk, so obviously the price goes up, and everybody, speaks badly about it, but they don't understand the mechanism, I think. Or if the market doesn't allow you to increase your prices to your customers, then obviously you have to find internal savings, and that means either you have to increase productivity, which I think we can easily do, or we pay our staff less.
bonuses.
Lower bonus.
Lower bonuses.
I think part of the adjustment.
What bonuses?
Part of the adjustment will have to be lower rates of return to bank shareholders and to bankers.
Yes, bankers. And also something about clients. So it's going to be more expensive to bank.
I'm convinced that banking, has been too cheap, and I think it will become more expensive. And I think we're starting to see that in the mortgage market.
Okay. Well, I think it's true that the credit was too cheap. I do agree, and I think the fact that it becomes a little more expensive, if it goes pair with more stability, is actually fine. We don't want to have very cheap credit and then suddenly there is a crisis, say yes, but now we don't roll over your line, which is what many people end up with. So then I prefer high credit rate more of the time, but more stability in the supply.
But do you think that when the banks have to comply to the stricter requirements, that the bank lending channel will come to a standstill?
The banks will say that it might. That is, in my opinion, my personal opinion, that is scare politics, that is scaremongering. A bank earns its money by lending. So, if the banks want to survive, lending cannot come to a standstill. In the transition period, that's actually the interesting thing about the studies that were done by the BIS. They did two studies into the effects of Basel III. One was for the transition period, and then one was for the steady state. And of course, they would also acknowledge that in the transition period, the negative effects are larger, but still small. I don't think, I think the system is very creative. Of course, the banks would like, not to have these things because it makes their lives a little bit more difficult. But once these things are in place, we'll do our job. We'll find a way to deal with it. And even if bank lending stops, then clearly we have to find another way. If you compare the financing structure of American companies, for example, and European companies, in America there's much more market financing and less bank lending. Basel III may well lead to a similar development here.
Okay.
Well, the ECB also warned that they think that banks during the transition period will take more risk to maintain their profitability, just because the capital requirements for profitability will decrease, and they are concerned that the banks will take more risk to maintain their profitability. Do you agree?
This is a micro argument, and I think it's very, very, very basic. Okay. I think if anything you want to, the tendency, when you have more and more leverage, you're even more tempted to take risks. You're not going to bear the full cost. So I think you can always say these things, but there is no... If you write a model that produces that, you have to have such stupid assumption that it's clear that it's a bad model. That's what I would say.
There's also a supervisor.
Yeah.
Surely the supervisor has to keep an eye on the amount of risk.
Speaking more about this transition period, are we speaking till 2018-19 when the Basel III will be fully implemented? That was the transition period we were speaking about?
I have to say, I don't have exactly in my hand, what is meant to kick in when exactly. So the problems in the transition period may actually be not all the way out to 2019.
Yeah, maybe earlier.
It may well be earlier. I'm not sure. Maybe Professor Perotti would know that better.
No, because what we see now is that some critics say that the real stress test for banks has yet to come. Because what we see is that banks need to refinance their activities in the coming years. For example, in 2011, we see that Italian banks until 2011 have to refinance 120 billion euros, and 24 banks from Portugal, Spain, and Greece have to refinance a total of 205 billion euros, which is, of course, a lot of money. What do you expect to happen in this period until 2011?
What I expect or what I hope?
Well, whatever you want.
I think we have not recognized all losses. Big question.
Yeah.
We haven't recognized a lot of losses. A lot have been just carried through by the central bank credit. The central bank keeps lending even though on collateral that is actually has losses that are not recognized. At some point, if the central bank continues to do this, we'll have inflation. If, in fact, there will be more inflation, there's no question about it. But how much inflation depends on whether central bank can exit the temporary liquidity provision before it becomes permanent money supply. And that means the private sector has to take over the financing of all this. So it's not just those countries, although those countries, particularly Spain, is very exposed to the ECB. But there is a general issue of more money from the private sector needing to carry assets.
Yeah.
And that means also recognizing losses. And that is where you need shareholders, bank shareholders to put money into the banks because they have to cover losses that are going to be there. And that is the job that we need to do. We need to put back real capital into the banking sector.
But how do you see this, this is in theory, but how do you see this process actually evolving? What do you expect to happen?
I find it very difficult to say what central banks will do right now, in the sense that if, I think the ECB keeps making noise about wanting to exit, but who they're going to sell their Greek debt? Or, you know, who's going to carry the Greek debt on the bank balance sheet, if not the ECB? So, I don't know. I mean, I have various scenarios, but I basically don't know.
The most likely scenario?
We'll muddle through and we'll have more information.
Okay. And what do you expect on...
Oh, well, and there's a couple of things that Professor Perotti said that I wouldn't agree with, but his overall conclusion I could live with. It could be a hairy period, but don't forget, you know, if you have to roll over debt, there's also obviously the money available. You have to attract it to where you need it. That's the problem. I find in general lots of people worry too much about the problem of refinancing. Generally, these things work out sort of okay.
ABN AMRO doesn't have any.
Until they don't.
ABN AMRO doesn't have any refinancing coming for the coming period.
No. Well, we have exposure to Greece, and we have a little bit of exposure to Ireland and Portugal and Spain. The problem of refinancing is more a problem for many of our customers, particularly sort of, you know, over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of, not the last 2 years, but prior to the crisis, we had a lot of leveraged loan issuance, and many of those are falling due over the next 2 years. And my God, who wants to refinance that?
Yeah. So those clients will have some problems in the near future.
Yes. But I think
how much of your client base is that? Like how many?
I wouldn't know.
No. So,
I think there's a question
yeah, we have a
from
question.
the audience.
Yes, it's a question on what was previously mentioned. You said that to make banks more stable,
It's not working.
in order to make banks more stable, it would be advisable to make mortgages more expensive. But if the customer at the same time can distract or deduce the interests paid from his taxes, then actually the weight is carried by the taxpayer as a whole. And isn't that an unequal treatment if you compare people who pay rent for the house and people who pay interest on a mortgage, which gives them the chance to acquire the property of the house? And isn't that in general an unequal treatment?
Yes, it is. But I mean, I'm not defending the almost unlimited tax deductibility in Holland of mortgage interest. You know, I think that's a system that probably we need to get rid of. But all I'm saying is that to me, I think it explains, you know, why things are happening in the mortgage market at the moment that are happening effectively because of the tax treatment of mortgage interest. There's essentially a sort of an economic rent on having debt. And in the past, I think that rent was basically owned by homeowners. And what you now see is that the financial system manages to get hold of part of that economic rent. That's sort of the way I would see it. And I'm not justifying that in any sort of moral sense. All I'm saying is, that's the market working for you. And as far as I'm concerned, the sooner we get rid of mortgage interest relief as we have it on for tax purposes, the better it is.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yes, of course.
I think it's a good point, it's a general point, because when you support credit and debtors, you are at the same time implicitly taxing the savers. I mean, everybody wonders why pension funds are underfunded at present and say, oh, interest rates are so low, that's terrible, that's why we can't earn on our savings. Well, the reason the interest rates are low is that we bailed out the borrowers. So, in some sense, when you say, oh, it's a good idea to come in and save the banks, there is a cost that it has to be recognized in the system overall. And so if you keep pushing credit because it's good, because it looks like there's more spending, it also, in the balance, there's going to be less of something else. So I think we need really more balance on that.
Is there another question?
Yeah. I was just wondering how are shareholders and society in general supposed to
hold bankers accountable for their actions? I mean, clearly it seems as if they're just playing games with other people's money, and now they present themselves as the saviors to get us out of this mess. I mean, no one's really being fired. You still have your job.
Well, I think maybe, but should I take the first?
I'm used to these sort of questions, but you take the first one.
Well, I mean, I'm happy you should answer that anyway, but I just want to say one general thing. I think we all should take some responsibility, not you particularly, I mean, you're too young, but I mean, there is, in some sense, society has become very addicted to credit and to
I mean, that's the point, though. I mean, the whole problem was based on easy credit, and it drove up the whole price of the
But
US
easy
mortgage
credit
market.
is driven by political pressure from voters. Easy credit is driven by consumers who just love to consume. Easy credit is driven by homeowners that want a nicer home and therefore they have to borrow more. Easy credit is also a bit in the system. So I agree with you, but you can single out the bankers to some extent, more than average, but in some sense it's in the system. One of the reasons it's hard to constrain the banks now, I can tell you, is that the politicians don't want to stop the flow of credit. No. So that, and the politicians you vote for. So, you know, that's, it's not, in that case it's not the bank's problem only, it's the fact that we have to get to a different recognition.
Okay, let's have Mr. De Jong answer this question.
Well, okay, first of all, you know, there's no doubt that banks have played a key role in the crisis. But they were not the only ones who contributed to the crisis. And in a way, I sometimes think of banks as being sort of drug traffickers in the drugs trade, you know, illegal and should be put away, but not the only ones who are involved in this. When you say, you know, look at the banks are still there, and you know, you make it quite personal. You say, well, you still have a job. You know, that's true. If I look at senior management, apart from myself, I was too low to be got rid of before the crisis. To be honest with you. Senior management, whole layers are gone. Our board is totally different now. The same with ING, not with Rabo, they survived. You know, a lot of international banks that got themselves into trouble, you will see that a lot of senior management is gone. Shareholders in Fortis Bank, they lost basically all their money. So what is left of that is you actually have a very substantial removal of let's say, responsible senior managers. Shareholders have lost a lot of money. Of course, you know, the logo is still there, etc. And it looks like it's a similar institution as it was before the crisis. But the truth is, it is not. Except that the savers, they still have their savings. And other guys who have been bailed out are the bondholders. And that, I think, is where you can have a sort of debate as to what extent bondholders should have also suffered a little bit more in this crisis. But, you know, I can assure you the you know, behind the facade, you know, certainly ABN AMRO is a completely different animal from what it was a couple of years ago.
And where are all those people working now then? Or are they just, has there been a drastic reduction in the staffing of all banks, or have they just gone and worked for another bank in a different position?
It's a very difficult question to answer.
I mean, obviously you don't know.
But
But
the redundancy is coming up now, right? There is a cow plan.
Sure. You know, if you take our chairperson, Rijkman Groening,
He was here before, by the way.
he was here before, he's out of a job. Well, he doesn't need a job, but he's doing his own thing. But, you know, I mean, what do you want? Put those people on an island and let them starve?
no, of course not. But I mean, it seems as if they just act en masse, and then I don't know what the actual alternative is. This is why I'm asking the question. They act en masse, and there's no way to actually hold them accountable.
Well, I think it's a very interesting discussion. We had also before a room for discussion, is that who should finally get a grip on this whole situation? Because we see that banks are driven by politics. Politics are driven, of course, by the voters and their short-term view on how things should be. So, what should we do in the future? Should there be some super governing system, or what should we do to ensure that crises like this won't happen again and innocent people won't be the dupe of this?
Well, Basel III.
Basel III? What do you say?
Well, some extended Basel III. Basel III is still insufficient. But, you know, I think rigorous implementation is important, and new tools. But I think more fundamentally, we really have to accept that we have to live with lower debt. And that has implications that are on economic growth rates, on pension, on a number of things have implications that we all should acknowledge. Because otherwise, we tell things to the bank, don't do that, but then everything in the system calls for more of a role for credit. Then we're not consistent.
But now we're speaking about the nature of the system, and is Basel III sufficient to address all these issues? Because is it coordinating enough the banking sector as a whole, not to let people take a lot of profits?
I think what Basel III is missing still, it should have more of a preventive, early stage intervention framework, but maybe that will not be discussed as part of Basel III, as part of related discussions. Basel III fixed long-term rules. What we need is more of the preventive infrastructure.
Well, you know, one effort that central bankers are currently involved in is macroprudential risk monitoring, etc. That tries to address sort of some of those issues. That's an interesting development. How effective it's going to be.
Well, let me say one thing. It has to be effective because it's very difficult to penalize whoever does wrong thing after the crisis. It's very difficult, actually. So even you say you live on an island, well, you know, they lost a lot of money. Is that enough? I mean, but you don't do it anyway. What you have to do is stop them from getting there. So we need to do a lot more prevention. That is what needs to be elaborated.
But in the whole time it's always we, but is there enough coordination in this sense? Because what we see is that a lot of nations still do their own thing, so to speak.
Yeah,
for example, what we see with the Fed, they just pumped 600 billion into the system now. Is that a good thing? Is that
it's good for some and not good for others?
But that's what I mean. There's no we in this whole idea. But we speak about we, but then individual countries do different things. So is there enough coordination on this level?
It's a good question. I mean, I can tell you who should theoretically do it. You know, I mean,
who should
the Financial Stability Board is an entity created to look at overall stability of the system. It includes not only banks but non-banks, which is very important. It transcends the G20, so in theory that's the right thing. Actually, it's part of the G20.
And do they have enough power to monitor everybody and to hold everybody responsible?
We'll see. We'll see. I think that is just not clear.
And what do you think actually about the fact that I just pumped 600 billion euros or dollars in the system now? What is going to happen with the economy now?
The economy is growing. It's growing a little bit too slowly, you know, for the taste of the American Central Bank and maybe also for the politicians. And they're trying to speed it up. I think it's probably going to work in the short term over the next couple of quarters. Probably what you get is a little bit higher growth, considerably higher. No, I don't think you get inflation immediately. You have an inflation risk further out, but not over the next 2 years. Okay. But you get significantly higher gold prices, perhaps commodity prices. I think equities will be supported. bond markets, I'm not so sure. The dollar perhaps a little weaker, maybe not. What worries me about it, I would actually agree with what the Fed has done, or what they are. You know, they haven't pushed 600 billion into the system. They're going to do it in, you know, at a pace of 75 per month. So they're, you know, it's sort of a, well, it's not a drip approach. It's like opening the tap quite a bit, and it's a constant flow of money into the economy. What worries me about it is that the Fed is doing monetary easing in a very unconventional way. And the American government is basically doing nothing with its budget. In Europe, we are making budget cutbacks, and the ECB is talking about exit strategy. And then you have the emerging economies where people are saying, well, you know, there's a currency war, and you know what, perhaps we should restrict capital flows. So the coordination seems to be completely gone. And particularly what worries me is the divergence that you see between European policymakers and American policymakers. That, I think, is frightening.
So the coordination.
We come back to the
world is.
Yeah, we come back to the previous question. There is no coordination in the whole.
I think there's another question from the audience.
Yes, I have maybe a more personal question to Mr. De Jong about ABN AMRO concerning something you said before. You said ABN AMRO is a completely different bank. RBS bought out a lot of people and knowledge from ABN, including the turbo. And I was reading up on the site the other day, and it seems that ABN is getting the turbo back, which might imply that you're pretending again to be a little bit more than you are, since a lot of everything you knew about it already was bought out.
Well, okay, the turbo is a product for aggressive investors, and that was an ABN AMRO invention, and RBS took it out, and it's a very successful product, so they brought it back. It's back. Before the crisis, we employed 110,000 people worldwide. We had a balance sheet total of about 1,100 billion euro. We currently employ 30,000 people. Our balance sheet total is about 400 billion. The risk, you know, we are state-owned. The owner, which is okay, you know, which is all the Dutch taxpayers, I guess, but for us in practice, it's the Dutch Finance Ministry. They have got involved in a number of areas. They have got involved in in the supply of capital, obviously. They have been involved in the remuneration policies. And also they have got involved in defining the risk appetite. We have a considerably lower risk appetite than we used to have. You know, I mean, if you say, well, you know, I can't see all these things, I understand that. You know, from the inside, it is very different.
So you're saying there is less ambition because of the new board and
No, I think
appetite for risk.
There's less appetite for risk, and I think the marketing phrase is we're still very ambitious, but we don't have any pretensions anymore.
Right.
We were obviously quite an arrogant bank. And in some people's eyes, perhaps still, we're trying to get away from that.
Okay. Thank you very much. In last week's session, we spoke with Ewald Engelen, who is a professor here at the University of Amsterdam in financial geography, and he's monitoring money flows over the world and what is going. And he called the European banking sector terminally sick. And why? Because he said that after the crisis, the European banks still have 2/3 of their toxic assets on their balance sheet, compared to 1/3 of US banks. What do you think about this?
Should I start? I think the Americans forced the banks to restructure more aggressively and to raise more capital than Europe. Europe has been putting less pressure on banks. There are many reasons, including that some governments need the banks very much.
Yeah.
And that is a bad situation for a government to be, because you cannot control someone that you depend on. I think it is absolutely true that European banks have not fully recognized loss. They haven't done enough recapitalization, and that is something that should happen. But there are they are often protected by their national government, who sees them as indispensable. So I think that is true. I think European banks have to do more. American banks have beat the bullet earlier. I think your shareholders in European banks should do more.
What do you think about it?
I don't agree with that really, you know. I mean, we have clear accounting rules. The accountants are very much aware that if they sign off on stuff that is, you know, ultimately unreliable, that they're going to be in trouble. A lot of these things is a very vague discussion, you know. How much are certain assets worth? You know, in distressed markets, you get prices that are distressed prices that are probably unrealistic prices.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that, okay, there was a solvency problem, but there was also a credibility problem. And the sort of the lender, or if you like, the supplier of last resort of credibility is the government.
Yeah.
So the government, you know, when the crisis hit and the banking system tried to threaten to implode, the governments built a safety net under the banks, and the result of that was that they got certain assets in that safety net, and, you know, and people saying, oh, the governments are supporting the banks and it's subsidized and the taxpayers is suffering. Well, of course, taxpayers' money was put at risk. But if you look at what has happened so far, the governments have actually, okay, you know, they're undoubtedly going to lose money on some of the assets, but on a lot of assets they're actually making money because they were underpriced.
Yes.
And governments bought them at very cheap levels. They supplied capital and you know, to, for example, to ING. You know, at a very high cost to ING. You know, many governments are making money. The American government is making money from the stuff that they have bought and are now selling off. Now, there are assets that they have that they'll lose money on, but it's not guaranteed that they lose money altogether.
We have heard this issue before, but in terms of pure toxic assets, on which we cannot know the real value yet in the future, I mean, that must be a troublesome situation for a bank to have. And if you compare the position of European banks to compare to American banks, I mean, you would be in a more preferable position if you have less toxic assets, I think.
Well, so what are the toxic assets?
Can I talk about that a second? So the Americans did a stress test before Europe, and they forced a lot of revaluation of assets, and they forced new capital issue. America raised a lot of capital. Still not enough, but in Europe, when they realized they had to do a stress test, and when they did the stress test, they left a lot of stuff out. So the stress test, so this is not about assumption, this is actually about looking at the numbers. And at first the stress test suggested most European banks were okay, and then it emerged that when they were done the calculation, lots of distressed assets were left out. So I think, quite frankly, it is no longer the case that we are in a situation where we are in extreme distress and therefore the asset price has to sacrifice. That was true in 2008, 2009, and that justifies an intervention. But that's no longer the case. They are just bad assets, and the losses have not been recognized.
Yeah.
And European banks have to recognize that to a greater degree, because not even the stress test brought them out.
What do you know about the about this ABN that you're taking losses, or?
Well, sort of, you know, the old toxic assets of these structured CDO products and these sort of things, we don't have those. You know, where I can't judge for others. I still think this is, you know, people are exaggerating this issue. And I still think that some markets are still in distress. If you look, for example, at, you know, 2-year Greek government bonds, they're yielding crazy levels, in my opinion, and the reason is because it's held by investors who, they're only sellers in that market, because if you're a pension fund and you have Greek bonds, you know, come the end of the year, you don't want to show to your, you know, to the accountant and therefore to the world that you own these things. So there's still indiscriminate selling, and there are no natural buyers. Therefore, I think there are still, you know, markets that are pretty distressed.
Okay.
But let's agree to disagree.
Yes. Okay. And how do you see the position of different banks in different regions in the future? For example, Asian banks or American banks or European banks, which one will be the most able to make profits in the future? Or is it very difficult to say?
Well, the rise of the Asian banks is unbelievable.
Yeah, of course, because there are a lot of...
You know, if you, in presentations, you know, I sometimes use, I have a slide where I use, I show the 10 largest banks in the world with their flags of their country of origin. And I showed it 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and now. And you know, 10 years ago there was no Chinese banks, and then over the time you see them coming up and you see them rising to the top. Now, I must say, that also happened with Japanese banks in the 1980s, and they all collapsed. They disappeared. All those names that we were talking about then have totally disappeared. I think the Chinese banks have more staying power than the Japanese banks at the time. You know, they are so large, they are so powerful. There is a very financially strong government behind them who will support them, I think, when if it comes to the crunch, and they need support.
But there's where all the growth will be happening. So,
sure.
Right? So Chinese bank, they'll be very profitable.
Well, remember that they're a state-owned entity with a Communist Party representative that is not very visible, but he plays a significant role. So, yes, it's funny that the most profitable banks in the world are run by communists. But it's true. But anyway, the point, one of the reasons they are profitable is that there is very little competition in China. So it's there are 4 big banks and only those, or limited other stuff. I don't know about how to answer in general the question of profitability with that in mind. I mean, they're going to be huge. I find it very difficult to assess. But I think just focusing on European banks, I think banks will be less profitable than they were before, and that is actually appropriate. And to the extent that their home market will grow less, that is something we have to factor in. I think that, but there might be better banks than before.
Yeah, I think time is almost up. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, just one more for the two gentlemen. What do you think about what is the intrinsic origin of the whole problem that we have with the banking system? Maybe that is, it's a really complex problem with the problems of sustainability, the power of oil companies, things like that. It's like the power of capitalism is so interwoven in our society that it has to do with many problems. Also, like that we're buying and buying and buying stuff that we don't need. It's like, don't we need to...
It's not unique to capitalism.
No, but don't we need to redefine what profit is and redefine what growth is? We only want to grow our capital, but how can we grow our capital when water is drying up? We can't make cotton everywhere anymore. The whole problem that we are like deteriorating Earth only for the benefit of the elite bankers and our own and of course for our own pension. Because
would you like to respond to that?
Well, I'll keep it short, but I mean, the financial system reflects the overall economic framing. I think you're right. I think there are very serious limits to growth. I think zero growth might be not just realistic, but healthy. And there is no politician that is going to tell you that, because it doesn't win you anything. But I think from a sort of stability and sustainability point of view, we actually should not grow. We should just make better use of the resources we have. We should use less credit.
So redefine.
Yes. I don't think it will happen, but I think we should do that.
Maybe
Well, I totally disagree with that, because if you say let's not, we as the world, let's not grow. But you know what? I would like to keep my situation the same. What I'm saying then is that people with a lower standard of living than I have, are not allowed to grow. To me that sounds incredibly unfair. Why would we condemn hundreds of millions of people to an extremely low standard of living? Then you say, okay, let's just redivide things. You know.
Redefine. What is growth?
Okay.
What is growth? Why do we need to grow? What is money? What is
Human progress.
Well, indeed, people want to move ahead in the world.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I understand.
Well, let's have two short. Thank you for your question.
Yeah.
Let's have two short closing questions. Do you have any plans for the future? Stay with ABN AMRO and be their chief economist coming period? I see some.
Well, I often say that I've been with ABN for a long time, and then people say, "Oh, they must like you." Well, the truth is, nobody else wanted me, and unless
we want to.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm a very happy person. I love my job. The whole crisis has been a very sobering experience. It's been a very painful experience. I have read a lot about financial crisis and reread it during the crisis. But when you read sort of historical stuff, you don't realize that there is also a very strong emotional element. And that has really surprised me, and it has hurt me, and I've lost a lot of sleep over it. But in general, I'm extremely happy. I'm extremely happy with my job. I hope the bank can sort of make it through, I'm going to stay where I am.
Thank you. And do you have any coming publications or?
Well, I'm very involved in the regulatory debate. I'm now 2 days a week macroprudential advisor to the DNB. An occasional advisor to the Bank of England and the Basel process. So I'm ready for 2 years very invested.
So you're also really not depressed?
I'm having a good crisis. I'm very sorry the crisis came, but certainly my job is a lot more interesting.
So we hope to see some of those insights in the new regulatory process now. Okay, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank our guests, and next week we have the founder of Randstad, Frits Goldsmede. So hope to see you all next week. Thank you very much.